What is it that you have internalized that will make you accept the rape and the victimization of the 5-year-old son in comparison to the relationship, the same-sex relationship?
Sexual violence by a woman is not taken to be violence of the same order as sexual violence by a man.
And it makes it very useful as a strategy if you want to convince somebody that an object or an individual or entire social group is a disgusting and should be avoided.
This speaking subject says, in my disgust of same-sex intimate relationships, I'm willing to forgive a rape of a minor.
I had a guest lecture. A colleague of mine who does great work on female sex offenders. And I'd asked her to come in to talk about her research. During the week, we were talking about gender and violence. And she talks about one particular woman, one of her participants in her study, who was currently incarcerated at the time of her interview. And this woman was incarcerated and she was serving a sentence for sexual assault against her 5-year-old son. And she talks about this, but she also talks about this particular woman's personal transition while she's been incarcerated, and she'd formed an intimate relationship with another cellmate. And at the end of it all, one of the students in my class pipes up and says, "I think that's really disgusting." And when we ask her to elaborate, she says she thinks the idea of same-sex relationships is quite disgusting, and she's quite willing to move beyond any kind of offense that this particular woman had committed prior to being incarcerated. So in particular, it's quite okay to have sex with your 5-year-old son, but it's not okay to have same-sex relationships with someone else.
This is quite an interesting one.
It is. It's actually a very challenging scenario that she paints, I think. Difficult to sort of get one's head around the implications of these two different sexual relations and the way in which the student positions herself to them.
And I think it also speaks to what the student is willing to accept, and I think it also then shows some inherent biases. To say what level of internalization what is it that you have internalized that will make you accept the rape and the victimization of the 5-year-old son in comparison to the relationship, the same-sex relationship. So there is a certain level there of sort of accepting that this scenario can play out normally and can be justified in comparison to the fact that someone is having a same-sex relationship in prison. So something has been normalized and accepted there that it shouldn't ordinarily be acceptable. Yeah.
I'm also wondering, when you talk about that, in another conversation, you've mentioned the question of how sexual violence by a woman is not taken to be violence of the same order as sexual violence by a man. And perhaps there's something of this in the scenario that we've heard, where because it's a woman, it somehow doesn't feel like it's as egregious as if it were a man doing that.
Yeah, that it's unimaginable. We can't fathom the idea that a man or a boy, because by virtue of their gender, could actually be raped or violated sexually. So I think it all speaks to the norm or associated with patriarchy then. And I like the starting point where Peace there talks about the case study in itself, the way or the case in itself, the way it starts from a position where we are meant to not ever imagine, or we can't really imagine this happening to a boy child. So our understandings of power relations become sort of static. You say, just because you are a man, just because you're a boy, this can never happen to you. I would rather that, though, than accept the moralities associated, or the sort of our moralities associated with same-sex relationships.
Yes.
And I think, Kacha, you also mentioned quite a lot around morality and
versus legality, because I see this piece, this specific piece, someone as an example, considering like two cases at the same moment. One where same-sex relationships are judged from a moral perspective, and another where a mother raping her child is judged from a legal perspective. And when these two perspectives are brought together, it shows us a tendency to desiring to justify violence. And I suggest that violence is such an obvious issue for us, that we have this attitude towards it. We kind of always ready to find reasons to tolerate it, even when the situation are incomparable, like these things. Like when I brought on a one table two different cases with different perspective. That's why I'm thinking about the issue morality versus legality here.
Yeah, it's a lot of discourses that are flowing as currents at the same time from this presentation. And one of them that we can get a handle on is the actual fragility of prejudice itself, where a speaking subject assumes the power and the privilege to be willing to actually forgive, apologize for, and look aside from a crime of sexual violence in order to spite the face of a human right, which is sexual orientation. This speaking subject says, in my disgust of same-sex intimate relationships, I'm willing to forgive a rape of a minor. Sounds like power, but it's actually fragility. It shows how fractured, how dismantled, and how fragile this subject is.
Right.
To really want to endorse even a crime just to insult a human right.
Yes. But William, I would argue that it's power and fragility intertwined. You know, because it is a power move. I mean, obviously, and to get back to what Katja was talking about, it's violence. I mean, the homophobia itself is a form of violence. But I think when it comes to the fragility, what you raise is so interesting, because it suggests to me that the power has a very weak foundation. It's got the prejudice itself, and the enactment of the prejudice is like you know, a house of cards. Like just the very fact of same-sex is enough to make the person feel like everything's going to, their whole identity is going to fall apart. Like, you know, they have no way of dealing with that reality, so that they have to have this tremendous defense against it. So that's, to me, that fragility is very interesting, because it almost, I want to say that it almost gives away the weakness of the position on which the prejudice is based. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that it becomes to some degree a form of defense, or
Yes.
justifying
right.
the things that I believe in. So I cannot be moved from where I am standing. This is how I always see it. So it's also a way of sort of reassuring oneself that my beliefs have always been, cementing one's position and
Right.
beliefs. And back to that question of morality as well, Melissa, that at what point does this become about the student themselves, right? So, so then it becomes about yourself, it becomes about my morals, my beliefs, but also the way power works, like you're saying, is that I have to continuously reassure myself that what I believe to be true is that. Which can, be a very trapping moment, like you're saying, it's weakness and power at the same time, because it's also, you're just telling yourself that what I believe is true and it should never be challenged by any case.
Can't be challenged,
It must not be challenged at all.
Because if you have to defend your moral bias to the extent of justifying criminality, you've really become fragile.
Really?
It's the nakedness of the empire of hate, where you will defend criminality, you will defend hate, you will defend prejudice to the extent of being complicit in crime. Look at the words that is being used. Disgust. It dehumanizes the speaker and dehumanizes the subject that is spoken of at the same time. And what is left of the speaker is the nakedness of the empires of hate.
It's especially interesting when you think of the things that we normally talk of causing disgust. You know, it's corpses and rotten food and feces and
toilet matter.
Yes. You know, and so I think that William, your point is so strong that, I mean, if I say you disgust me, I'm automatically dehumanizing you. I'm putting you in that category of those things that create that visceral, like nauseating response, you know?
And we were talking earlier with Katja before the shoot that it's a very strong emotion, like, I mean, from a sort of affective perspective, like it shows, like to get to a point where you are disgusted by a same-sex relationship, that's a very strong affect. Like William mentioned the empire of hate. I think it really shows how hate circulates and how it's also normalized, because I'd also like to imagine how many students listening to this would buy into it, you know, that the effects are so profound. I think it's a very strong emotion, like to be disgusted by other people's visibility and, you know, this woman's sexual orientation that has nothing to do with you at all.
See, you're just making me wonder. You know, can disgust be the basis for morality?
You know, when I have been preparing for this episode, I found a nice piece of study on disgust and the role of disgust in moral judgment. How we beautifully somehow combine very different things in our minds to justify one and judge another things. And it's interesting that one of the notable features of disgust is not just universality and straight, but also the way how it operates through associations. And how associations like invite us to discuss something, to get disgusting, to get disgusted. And it makes it very useful as a strategy if you want to convince somebody that an object or an individual or entire social groups, as we can observe in this piece of like a lecture, or entire social group is a disgusting and should be avoided. And also it was funny that people who are easy to get disgusted are more likely to be politically conservative. Can you imagine?
That is an interesting point, yes. But, you know, you're talking about reading now and sort of outside sources. Barbara Nussbaum also talks about disgust. She's also written on disgust. And she writes about the politics of disgust, which I think is exactly what we're seeing here, is how disgust gets mobilized as a way of creating boundaries between those that are acceptable and those that aren't, and becomes, a vehicle of power to marginalize people. And of course, Katja, what you mentioned, I mean, with any of these emotions, it's the way it circulates. How it gains power when it circulates.
Do you mean that all the emotions that we have can be weaponized or used as a basis of
manipulation? Yes, weaponized or mobilized, if we like them. I think we would say mobilized. As opposed to, a politics of compassion or politics of rights or whatever one would want to put in contrast to the way the politics of disgust is being mobilized here,
Yeah, thank you for roping in literature and to buttress the conversation that we are having. I have in mind Gordon Allport's 1958 outline of the stages of prejudice from interlocution, which is supposedly innocent and harmless speech, to extermination. Because definitely the two women that discussed this speaker are truthfully not disgusting, but it's a genocidal wish in the mind of the hater.
Definitely.
In the mind of the prejudiced subject, that wishes that these two subjects were treated as toilet matter, waste matter. That is disgusting. It's a genocidal wish.
It is.
So
It is.
that language is not just violent language, but it's language that really proposes violence against the other.
Because if we can
It
mobilize...
frames them in disgusting terms so that killing, exterminating, and removing them can be justified and apologized for.
yeah.
So there is something genocidal in such language.
That language, it is sort of just in and of itself, it carries a genocidal impulse.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I also like that you spoke about empathy and care, which is a better way to have looked at the case. I mean, it was really about the rape that took place, right? I think that was the central point, and where the response should have been premised on to say, this child, what's going to happen to this boy who has been violated by the mother, right? So the more, I don't really understand at what point it became a sort of a point of comparison to say, I'd rather this than that.
Yes.
And I like the fact that we're talking about how this became more about the student themselves.
Yes.
To say, was it really about the case, or it's a matter of, having to convince myself that my prejudices are true and cemented and they can never be shaken. It reminds me of that facilitation we had, Melissa, where a student spoke about sort of in justification of the Nazi.
Yes.
When they said, and they were saying, I'd rather, it's almost like saying, I'd rather have Hitler and the Nazis and all of that. At what point was the moral judgment taken to a point of saying, compare this with that?
Yes.
And I think these prejudices are also the way we operate in society, where it's a very selfish position to just make it about yourself and your judgments without necessarily thinking about the other.
Right.
So I think, it shows there that there's a lack of care. When we deal with such matters, you really have to operate within a premise of care and empathy, and which is
yes, and imagination. Actually imagining the life. I mean, to me, again, we're back to the fragility of that prejudice, because if you think of the power relations between the mother and the child, I mean, there's no question that there's terrible abuse, and then to compare that, with a same-sex relationship between two adults who are consensually entering a relationship and, finding meaning, finding happiness, within their constrained environment. But when I talk about like the imagination, you talk about care. It's sort of like, why is there so little grasp of what that relationship means by contrast with what the original crime meant, Yeah.
Yeah, the other issue I think that we can look at and really seek to magnify is the systemic and structural nature of what is spoken here. The bravado with which this speaking subject speaks is not based really on that individual speaker. When this I says, I am disgusted by this, they are not speaking about the I as in singular, but they have the privilege and the power and the confidence to know that there are many structures and systems of power that are behind what I
That's
believe.
backing them.
Like in our present world, there is a death sentence attached to same-sex relationships in one African country. There is severe punishment in several African countries for same-sex relationships. Far much more severe than the rape of children, the rape of women, and the rape of other people. So the representativity and representativeness of this voice must worry us. Because this person is so arrogant because they know there's power behind what they're saying. And they are safe, they are covered up, there's backup for this hate.
Well, then they've got to encounter the power that's behind our voices in saying that, that is just unacceptable and a justification, violence justifying more violence and just, not what we want in our society.
Yeah, very interesting conversations, and to come also to William's point around structures and systems. I think there's also that question of discourse, to say when we walk, when we talk, we represent these systems of power, and this speaker themselves, like I like that point, William, that they're not necessarily speaking from their own. It is a positionality that you speak from, but you don't realize the entire implications, the wider implications of these individual statements, that it's really about patriarchy, it's about heteronormativity, that you would rather have this evil instead of that evil, is also a choice that's based on the prejudices that society has also, taught other people. So, and I like the fact that we always talk about learning and unlearning, that there's certainly a lot that we learn in these social infrastructures that we then have to think about how that student, for example, would also require a moment of unlearning and recognize the implications, the wider implications of these sort of small sentences that are made in class. That it's really what keeps the whole system functional, which is very sad.
I'm pretty sure peace would have provided a moment of unlearning for that student.
Certainly.
I'm sure she would have known how to challenge it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly.
And I believe it's important that we openly discuss it, like together, and this kind of issues, people raise in our at least educational academic environment. I believe that it's
and to accumulate the vocabulary to name it when we see it, and the diction to pinpoint what is this and what is it doing.
Because it's so tricky. It's so tricky to put these two absolute different cases, what table, and find some measure, to provide your decision or something. It's so tricky that I believe that it's good that it's about developing our vocabulary.
Thank you.
To shed light on the intersex perspective, it's very difficult to sort of fit in into the social standards of what a male or what a female is supposed to look and be like.
It's just so easy to then see how when you binarize or dichotomize something that actually has a huge range of diversity, it only results in exclusion and violence.
This myth around fairness in sport, that only certain differences would make a huge difference here, that because you're intersex, no one is investigating height, differences in sort of muscle composition, but it seems to be the central point of debate is because you're intersex, you can't participate in this sport.
The irony of surveillance is, if this is such a fact of nature, why do you have to put so much energy into policing and surveilling and checking up if it really is this thing? You are telling me that this is a fact of nature, and yet you spend all your time constantly checking, is it still? Is it still?